Thomas Hobbes was an English philosopher, one of the founders of modern political philosophy, and one of history's great misanthropes. Hobbes was one of the first Europeans to write about the state of nature, the way humans must have lived before civil society could tell them to live any differently. According to Hobbes, this state of nature was a war of all against all. People's lives were solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. He thought that this state of affairs could only end with the creation of a singular monster that would terrorize everyone to such a degree that they would finally give up their selfishness, wickedness, and violence on pain of death. That Leviathan, the state, was the monster we need to keep us in check so we don't tear each other limb from limb. A century later, there was another European philosopher who wrote quite a bit about the state of nature, named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He had a somewhat different view of the matter. Rousseau believed that a natural moral sense or animal pity defined human nature, and that people only became malicious, violent, corrupt, and selfish when the pressures and injustices of civil society made them so. Both of them were working at a time when Europeans had only begun to understand the wider, other-than-European world. We've learned a lot of things since then. I'd like to start with the sheer depth of human history. Let's call this blue box 5,000 years. That's roughly the span of recorded history. Hobbes would have considered this all the time since the creation of the world. The agricultural revolution happened 10,000 years ago, but we now know that humans have dwelt on this planet for closer to 2 million years. Those are big numbers, and in all that time, an intuitive sense of numbers that big has never made it onto evolution's checklist. But visual acuity certainly has, so let's make this visual. Every single blue cube here is 5,000 years of human history. But this is the only one we have records about, and these two are the only ones in which anyone anywhere was farming anything. For all the rest of this, 99.75% of all of human history, every single human being on the planet was a hunter-gatherer. It was really only in the latter half of the 20th century that we started to do any sort of serious study of the economics of hunting and gathering and the effect that's had on how they live. We learned that individual hunter-gatherers don't usually have a terribly high success rate. The average hunter returns home with food about 1 time in 4. If we engage in the sort of thought experiment that Hobbes favored, we can imagine a solitary Upper Paleolithic hunter who's lucky enough to take down a mammoth. There's no way he can eat all of it, and big scavengers quickly chase him off. The next 3 days, he doesn't catch anything, so he goes hungry. And if he ever gets hurt, or if he ever gets sick, say because his immune system is weaker, because he only gets to eat once every 4 days on average, there is no one to help him, and his situation gets even worse. His solitary life is getting nastier and shorter by the minute. This hunter might not be able to store meat directly, but he can invest it in other people by sharing it. He might only have a 1 in 4 chance of catching something on any given day, but if he works together with 4 other hunters, there's a 76% chance that one of them will catch something, and they'll all have plenty to eat. If he gets hurt or sick, there are people who can take care of him. He can even afford to take it easy sometimes. When Richard Lee studied the sand in the 1960s, during one of the worst droughts in the recorded history of the region in the Kalahari Desert, he found that it took them just 20 hours to gather all the food they needed each week. This might be why one of the very few things all hunter-gatherers seem to agree on, from the poles to the equator, is that sharing is the prime virtue, the central organizing concept not just for their societies, but their entire way of seeing and understanding the world. Hunter-gatherers rarely have leaders. Many seem actively hostile to any suggestion of leadership and have developed customs specifically engineered to keep leaders from emerging. Instead, hunter-gatherers live by consensus. It takes a long time, but they rarely face the sort of crisis that requires quick decisions, so they can take their time to reach the best decision and make sure that everyone is heard. Conflict is rare among them. On an interpersonal level, because the critical survival value of sharing also makes it critical for people to get along, and so they value conflict resolution very highly. Between groups, there's little reason to fight, since your neighbors don't really have anything to take. Marshall Solins called hunter-gatherers the original affluent society because they always have everything they want, but it's widely distributed, not stored up in caches worth fighting over. 10,000 years ago, yesterday by the scale of this story, Çatalhöyük was built in Turkey. It's one of the very first cities. It shows remarkable signs of an egalitarian society, but that didn't last long. Most of the earliest cities are built around an enormous palace and a few large houses near it, but the vast majority of the buildings in these cities were one-room hovels. Before the agricultural revolution, we find only a few scattered examples of inequality in places like Songir. After the agricultural revolution, we find it suddenly and everywhere. At the same time, we have the first depictions of battle in cave art from Australia, and the first skeletons with clear evidence of meeting violent ends at the hands of other human beings. For the first time, people had something worth fighting and dying for: their fields. For the first time, you had neighbors who had things worth taking, and for the first time, you couldn't simply go somewhere else if they came to rob you. For the first time, robbery and murder became effective strategies to get the things you need. Hobbes was wrong about the state of nature, but Rousseau only lucked into getting anything right. He was right that in the state of nature we share and cooperate and take care of one another, but not because of our animal pity. It's because sharing and cooperation are powerfully effective evolutionary strategies. We are a highly specialized species, and what we've specialized in is sharing. Human nature is peace, cooperation, and consensus. For the past few thousand years, a blink of the evolutionary eye, a few groups of humans embarked on an experiment that would seem to invert everything in our nature. But it's important to maintain some perspective and remember that this is a brief aberration. It's not who we are.